For the most part, the exhibition here, I presented two main bodies of work. One is sort of the carved stone work with either of the copper, silver, or gold leaf. And that series sort of relates to sort of fitting rocks together so that they're like foam on water. Is sort of the original process that I was working towards. And the other pieces in the show, which are similar to this piece here, which is Gather, are works that deal with hammered copper. So I take an 1/8 inch copper plate and I hammer it in a way that I usually take forms, map forms, things that sort of deal with water and shorelines. And by informing the landscape, or in this sense, mapping the landscape, I impacted both through calculated and miscalculated blows, in the sense that these maps are quite accurate, but only up to the point where I start to get tired, and through the process of being tired, I make subtle mistakes, even some great mistakes where I will drop the hammer onto the surface, which will cause damage. And it's a reflection on how we sort of have dealt with the landscape of North America, our shorelines, how we impact our landscape. And that it's not necessarily through malice, sometimes it's just through experience. So we sort of have to go through a process of learning, and we're always constantly learning, usually from our mistakes. And so a lot of this work sort of deals with that, and for me it's about that personal expression where I actually am that individual. So these things are done by hand, and it's a long, arduous process. And I sort of relate that to also how I was doing a piece, and a lot of my work has to do with water and that influence between where the water meets the land. And it is very much like a wave action. There's that certain consistency to waves when they hit the shoreline. And for me, the hammering process is very much like that, where it's sort of this repetitive process. And it works very well, but every so often there's a subtle change. It's sort of like when you're walking on the beach and you sort of have that water flowing in and out from the shoreline. And you think you have it, and you think you understand it, and then all of a sudden one wave will come in and you'll get soaked. You get both of your shoes wet. And there's that experience where we think we understand something, and then all of a sudden in nature there's a change. And so a lot of my work has to do with those subtle reflections, I guess. And for me, that's an important starting point to the work. A lot of the work is very simple in its approach. But in that simplicity, you sort of can offer or get into the work more, and there's more details available. And I don't require for everybody to, understand all the little nuances that I put into the material or into the processes. If people just appreciate them for their aesthetic value, I'm quite happy with that. For myself, these works are originally to deal with, the first piece I did dealt with the Yukon and up north and about resource extraction. And what I was in awe with when I was up there in the Yukon was that this landscape was so pristine and so gorgeous, the colors, the textures, and beneath that surface, as an artist, as a person who works with materials, I understand where my materials come from, and it's from that landscape. So in sitting up there, I could actually look at the mountains, and you could see that, this mountain would have this much coal, this mountain has that much steel, this mountain has this much copper. There's an expression of the value of the commodity that comes from that rich resource. And so I wanted to create these pieces that sort of discuss that idea where there's this beautiful surface that people can get lost in, but beneath that surface, beneath these surfaces, is resource, is materials, things that come from that wilderness and are extracted and processed, and we utilize. And we utilize all the materials that we use in our daily lives come from the land. And so that's what the expression behind these works are, in a very simplistic idea, but it's actually not terribly simplistic if you think about it. So that's sort of where a lot of the work comes from. And for this exhibition itself, Embankment, it was very much about where my grandparents came from. And returning home, probably about 3 years ago now, I was able to see where they came from and see the changes. So it was a small train community, it used to be a sawmill town, which basically is all gone now. The only two things that are really left standing are the embankment, which the train used to travel on, and they've actually torn up the tracks. So all the railway ties, the rails are gone. All the houses in the community are pretty much gone now, as well as the docks. Like, it was very much a fishing community as well. It was where my grandparents lived. It was their trap line area. So they grew up in the wilderness, or close to civilization in the wintertime. That's where their summer house was. And so it was an interesting experience to see that, and also, you know, it was the embankment and the hydro poles, or telegraph poles that existed there, and they're still standing. And it was interesting that these poles sort of had returned to nature, because they were no longer separated from the wilderness. The wilderness had encroached around them. So you could sort of see these trees, or these sentinels, in a sense, you know, these objects that were guardians, you know, for us, that carried our communications, which allowed us to go into wilderness and to be still connected to the rest of the world. We're now standing without wires in the forest. And it's sort of, I've always had this appreciation for telephone poles and hydro poles, just because, in the sense that, you know, they've lived a full life, that there are these trees that had lived and had essentially been de-limbed and derooted and debarked and preserved, and then basically brought back out and situated next to the forest. And it's just sort of that interesting experience where you know, it's preserved and it stands there as part of us. It's a stand-in for us as far as how we sort of encroached on nature, but at the same time, how things sort of get left behind. So, like, there's a series of drawings in this exhibition, wireless, and it's sort of not in the sense of urbanness where you think of wireless meaning free of wires. It's being free of wires, but it's being left. It's being isolated. Well, we think of it as being freed up. So it's sort of wanting to deal with those ideas and those issues.